Hello everybody, welcome to Fight Scene. This is my YouTube channel where I go over all things MMA. And today I want to talk a little bit about UFC 221, which is Rockhold versus Romero. The UFC pay-per-view has just ended about 5 minutes ago, and I just wanted to give you a couple of thoughts that I had about the fight, specifically versus Rockhold and Yoel Romero, the main event. I think it was really the only part of the pay-per-view that was really eventful for me. There were some good fights. There were some great, exciting fights on the card for sure, but the only one that really had any sort of longer-term significance, I think, is the Romero versus Rockhold fight. And so we'll touch on the Mark Hunt fight a little bit as well, but I really just want to talk about the main event today. If you have not seen the fight event, if you've not seen the pay-per-view, if you've not watched UFC 221, and you're worried about finding out the results of the fights, it's probably a good time to turn off this video because there will be some spoilers, and so do that now. Otherwise, you know, you have your fate in your own hands, so to speak, as far as learning the results if you didn't want to. You've been forewarned. So the fight really didn't go at all how I expected it to go. If you watched my previous video on my prediction and analysis of how the fight was going to go, I was very wrong. So in the third round, Yoel Romero TKOs Rockhold, which was a bit of a surprise. I mean, I had a friend of mine watch the previous video that I had, and he said, you know, you're pretty biased towards Rockhold, and he assumed I was a big fan of Luke's, and I'm not really actually that big of a fan of Luke's. I don't know that very many people are because of his attitude in general. But I really thought that he had all the skills to really make this a one-sided fight. But he was TKO'd in the third round. And I was pretty surprised. I got to admit that Yoel Romero's stand-up looked a lot better than I thought it would. Everybody knows that Yoel has a lot of explosive power, and that's his main strength. But I never thought that technically he was that strong of a stand-up fighter. And, you know, he had lost a lot of, in my opinion, he kind of lost a lot of fights. He sort of cheated his way to a win against Tim Kennedy, and he had that split decision against Jacare, and then he lost to Whitaker. So, you know, I don't want to say that I was a hater because I do like Yoel Romero as a personality, but I was a bit of a hater as far as his skills go. And he really shut me up tonight. So he did show some really good competency on the feet, and Rockhold wasn't able to do what he wanted to in the stand-up. They were both very tentative. They both respected each other a great deal. And in the first round, there wasn't really anything going on. And I remember thinking to myself, this is really going to favor Rockhold in the long run. They're just going to sort of exchange some combos, but nothing really happening. And in the long run, Yoel will get tired, and this will really favor Luke. And so that's what the first round was. It's really just a feeling each other out process. The second round, Yoel comes out with a number of flurries, and it really looked like he won the round, and he looked like he was the better fighter. But I had it in the back of my mind again, is he going to gas out? Well, in the third round, it didn't matter because he landed a big overhand right on Luke, which stumbled him and put him up against the mat. Jimmy Smith said that he thought that he was knocked out and that was the end of the fight. But Luke was okay at that point. He had fallen over. He had his back to the cage. He was getting up. And Yoel Romero lands just this massive uppercut while Luke is getting up right on the button. And it puts Rockhold out completely cold. So maybe it wasn't a TKO. It was a knockout now that I rethink it. So the unfortunate part of this fight is that Yoel Romero came in overweight. He took this fight on short notice, which is what he is saying is one of the factors that contributed to him missing weight. And so this fight was not for the interim belt in regards to Yoel Romero. If Rockhold had won, he would have been considered the interim champion. But because Yoel won and missed weight, he is not considered the interim champion. Now, in the end, it doesn't really matter because his next fight is going to be against Robert Whitaker either way. So it doesn't necessarily matter that he doesn't have the belt. It's really just for promotional purposes on behalf of the UFC. But it is worth noting that he did come in overweight. And so I expect a lot of big Rockhold fans will take issue with this, that Yoel is known to sort of play the game a little bit in regards to I don't know, taking certain liberties with the rules. We've seen that in past fights with him, and so I'm not going to come out right and say that he intentionally missed weight, but even if he did miss weight and not needing to cut those extra 4 pounds to really drain himself, he benefited by having a larger gas tank in the fight, and he gets a shot at Whitaker either way. So it really wouldn't have mattered whether or not he has that official belt or not. It's really just for business purposes on the UFC that they can't promote it a certain way. And so, you know, my hats are off to Yoel Romero. He really surprised me. I didn't think he would do as good as he did, and really cemented himself as the #2 middleweight in the world next to Robert Whitaker, who's the champion who already beat him once. It's kind of a worst case scenario, I think, for the UFC in this one, for business. I mean, as far as fighting goes, it doesn't really matter. But as far as business goes, they can't promote it as an interim belt, and they have a rematch against the fight that between Whitaker and Yoel Romero, which is probably going to look very similar to the first one. Maybe not. I've been wrong once in regards to Yoel Romero, but it's probably worst case scenario as far as business goes. So that's a bit of a challenge. And then my last thought on this fight is, you know, I don't want to speak bad about anybody, any fighter or their camp, because, you know, who am I to say anything bad about a fighter and somebody that's committed their life to this? But Henry Hooft, it's a bit of a conundrum for me, because you hear Joe Rogan talk about how amazing of a trainer he is, and you can't deny that he is an incredibly knowledgeable person about the sport, and everybody talks about how good of a trainer he is, and that is probably very true. I've never trained with him, so I don't know. The challenge that I have with Henry Hooft is he does not seem, his fighters, I should say, don't produce strong results in championship fights. When the rubber hits the road, Blackhouse, his former camp, didn't win championship fights. If we look at Anthony Johnson, if we look at Vitor Belfort, and now you look at Luke Rockhold in this championship fight, I've not seen the results out of the Blackhouse and now Henry Hooft training camp that we've seen out of other camps, and it feels like oftentimes they're able to train fighters to get to that big dance, but yet when it finally gets to that point, they're not winning those fights. It could be a giant coincidence, and I'm not trying to say that he's not a good trainer. I'm sure he is an excellent trainer, but it really did stand out in my mind at some point when they were interviewing Yoel Romero that Henry's camp, Overeem being another example of a fighter that when really in the spotlight fell short of what we know to be strong potential out of him as a fighter. And I just remember thinking a couple times, like, Blackhouse never really shined, or not Blackhouse, sorry, I keep saying Blackhouse, I mean the Black Zillions, my apologies. The Black Zillions. Blackhouse is a completely different story. The Black Zillions, you know, you had Rashad Evans, you had Overeem, you had Anthony Johnson, you had Vitor Belfort, all amazing fighters who won a lot of great fights, but it felt like when it really came time to execute in that championship main event, they fell short. I'm not putting that on Henry's shoulders, but it's something that I think is notable, and this was Luke Rockhold's first full camp, or at least first championship fight at that camp. He did have his old partner, training partners and coaches in his corner for the fight, but in the embedded series we heard him talk a lot about his new camp and shaking things up. It didn't work for him in this fight. I can't say that that's the cause. I think Yoel was just the better fighter tonight, but it's something that I definitely noticed when I was going through it. And so that's that fight. We'll see how it goes. Maybe Whitaker versus Yoel will look a lot different, but I don't know. I would put my money on Whitaker in that fight again. I think it probably looks very similar. And look, Yoel Romero is not getting any younger. The man is 40 years old, an incredible athlete for sure, but the fight game is not, it's a young man's game, or at least a 30-year-old man's game. And so we'll see what that looks like. He was limping at the end of the fight, so potentially he has an injury and that fight's going to be put off a little while. And my money would be on Whitaker in the next fight, but I'll put out a video to let you know as that fight approaches my exact thoughts on the rematch between those two. Switching gears for a second, let's just touch on the fact that Mark Hunt lost via unanimous decision to Curtis Blades, a pretty big decision. I think a lot of the judges had it 30-26, so some 10-8 rounds in there. Mark Hunt had a great first round and reminded Curtis Blades that he needs to stay away from Mark's power and take him down as fast as possible. You know, Brock Lesnar kind of, I would say, gave the game plan on how to beat Mark Hunt, but it wasn't really a secret. Mark Hunt has never really had that great of a ground game, and it's unfortunate. You know, he is one of the pioneers of the sport, I would say, and he never really truly evolved from his K1 days into MMA. He had some great wins. He was a top 10 heavyweight for a long time, and he was on the verge of a title shot at heavyweight not that long ago. But that was because all of his matchups were ones that favored his striking style. When guys came in there to take him down and he wanted to try and submit him, I think of, you know, the Sean McCorkles of the world who would take him down and submit him. Mark Hunt never had a ground game, and he had fighters that favored his stand-up style. But when somebody wants to take him down, it's a tough night for Mark Hunt. So I'm really sad to see the outcome of that fight. I'm a big Mark Hunt fan. I used to be a bigger Mark Hunt fan. I've not loved his sort of profanity-laced tirades recently. He seems pretty disgruntled, and he just wants to be out of the UFC, at least. But it's sad to see Mark Hunt kind of go out this way with a fighter just really grinding him out. But he didn't look like himself in that fight. He had a great first round, but after that, it was sort of that Brock Lesnar fight all over again. And so Curtis Blades comes out with the win, and he really is a top 10 heavyweight. I would favor Curtis Blades in a rematch against Francis Ngannou for sure. Take that same strategy, tire Francis out. I'd love to see that rematch. And so who knows what's next for Curtis Blades, but I think he's got a bright future at heavyweight. Not much of a match for Stipe, but definitely going to be a top 5 heavyweight, I think. Anyway, that's my prediction, or that's my analysis of UFC 221. It's getting a bit late. I'm starting to stumble over my words. I really appreciate you watching. Keep an eye out for content this week, and we'll see you at the next fight card.